Hey, I'm Jeremy, the head brewer at Little Brown Jug. Welcome to the Flatlanders virtual tasting event. Thank you so much for picking up our beers and the taster glasses. I'm going to be taking you through a tasting of the 4 beers that you have. We're going to start with the Summer Lager, go to the Hefeweizen, then to the Golden Ale, and finish with the Monarchy Brown Ale. Alright, first up we're going to start with our Summer Lager. We first brewed this beer last year. We designed this beer to be very simple. It's just Pilsner malt with a little bit of Munich malt to give it a bit of malty goodness, a little bit of body. Past that, we used Laurel hops in our whirlpool. That allowed it to have that bright lemon, pepper, berry aroma and flavor. That's all coming from the use of the Laurel hops. But what makes this beer distinct amongst the other ones that we're going to be tasting today is that it is a lager. And the difference between an ale and a lager is going to be the yeast that you use. There's an ale yeast, which typically will rip through a fermentation process very quickly. I like to think of it like a Tasmanian devil. It just goes through and digests a whole bunch of sugars, creates a whole bunch of carbon dioxide and ethanol, and it works through really quickly, but it's pretty inefficient. That's why ales are typically left with a lot of body and there's a lot of substance to them because of all the partially digested sugars and the fermentation byproducts. Whereas a lager yeast, I think of it more as how I move in the winter. Really slow. The environment that you ferment a lager in is really cold, so everything just happens a lot more slowly. It's methodical, it's meticulous, it really breaks down every sugar, and it really efficiently cleans up the beer. So there's not as many byproducts, not as many partially digested sugars, and you end up with a clean and refreshing finish on the beer. All right. So, the Summer Lager. Beautiful gold color, nice and clear, big white foamy head on top. Has the distinct lager aroma. The hops come through, the Laurel hops. I smell lemon, floral, little berry notes too. Cheers. Nice, crisp, clean mouthfeel. Flavors, again, that maltiness comes through from the Munich malt. Little bit of bitterness at the end coming from the hops. Again, that citrus, little pepperiness to it. Very clean, refreshing, enjoyable beer. Cheers, I hope you like it too. Next up is our Hefeweizen. This is our first season brewing our Hefeweizen. It's a traditional German wheat beer. Again, similar to the Summer Lager, we designed this beer to really pair well with summer. It's not too heavy, it's a lower alcohol beer, 4.7%. It's very bright and refreshing, yet fluffy and creamy from the use of all of that wheat. And so, with the Hefeweizen specifically, normally with the beer, they're traditionally barley-based beers. And so still, there's barley in the Hefeweizen, but more than half of the grain that was used in the creation of this beer was actually malted wheat. In commercial examples, you're going to experience anywhere from 50 to 70% of the grains that are used in the beer being wheat. And we actually pushed the envelope with this one and went over 70% because when we were testing out recipes, we found that we really, really enjoyed what the excessive wheat component of the grain bill brought to the table. We kept the bitterness on the beer very low to keep it true to style, and we really focused a lot more on the wheat and the yeast. So this beer is unfiltered, so it's going to have a hazy, cloudy appearance. And when you are pouring it for yourself, because it's unfiltered, in the can there's going to be yeast that settles to the bottom, depending on how long and what storage conditions the can has been exposed to. So what you're going to want to do to bring the yeast back into the beer, back into suspension, is actually lay down the can and roll it back and forth. You can also upend it. I know that traditionally you don't want to shake your beer because it's going to explode when you open it up. And Hefeweizens are traditionally more carbonated than other beers because typically they'll experience a natural carbonation in the bottle. We didn't have the ability to do a natural carbonation on this beer, but it is still carbonated higher than some of the other beers we have to really cut through the thickness and still allow it to be bright and refreshing. All right, now the best part, let's give it a taste. So even though I did some rocking and rolling with the can, it still didn't explode, thankfully. You don't want to be too aggressive with it. If you're actually like shaking it all over the place, when you open it up, you're likely to have a fountain of gushing beer. Nobody wants that. So again, you're gonna give it a pour, in the taster glass. Typically, if you're pouring it into one of our Hefeweizen glasses or really any glassware, you're going to get about halfway down before you give it a stir, but because we're just going into the taster, I'll stir it up there. Here's what we got. So you'll notice compared to the summer lager, you can't actually see through it because of the haziness. All of the color and everything is all coming from the wheat and the barley. Giving it a smell. It smells like banana, cloves, like wheat. Like it actually has a bready complexion to it as well. And there is a little bit of vanilla. The beer finished quite dry. There isn't a lot of residual sugar left in there, but because the bitterness of this beer is so low, the sweetness really actually shines through. Nice creamy, full body to it. Not too sweet. Again, that banana, the clove, it all comes through in the flavor. But the dryness, it just kind of finishes. The aftertaste just leaves you a little bit of weedy, grainy malt. Good job, yeast. Cheers. And next up, we've got our Golden Ale. So this is the second beer that we ever produced here at Little Brown Jug. It all started with 1919, but then we moved on to the Golden Ale as our first limited release. It's now available year-round, and we have it in single serve or 4-packs, where you'll sometimes find it in some of our variety packs as well. This beer is a Belgian Golden Ale. It's a little bit higher alcohol content. It clocks in at 6.5%, but it's not a heavy, sweet, alcohol-rich beer. It's still light and crisp and refreshing. There's going to be a lot of honey complexion to it. You're going to be able to smell it and taste it, but it's not overly sweet. You're not going to necessarily pull that it's like distinctly a honey beer. There is honey used in it, but the majority of the sugars that are brought to the table from the honey, they're fully fermentable. So when you're using barley or you're using wheat, you get a percentage of sugar that you provide to the wort, which gets fermented into becoming beer. You get a percentage of that ferments away, but it only goes so far. There's what we call a fermentation. It's like a threshold. It'll only dissolve, the yeast will only digest so much sugar, and then it'll stop. So the use of honey is going to add more fermentable sugars, but because these sugars are different than the sugars that we extract out of the barley, when we mash our barley, we're going to be extracting maltose and glucose and maltotriose, different larger chain glucose molecules. We're going to have more longer chain sugars. Whereas honey is a nice simple sugar. It breaks down cleanly. So during fermentation, by having the honey in there, it ferments it completely away. That's a truck. We add our honey in during the boil, while it's in the kettle, and the sugars that we introduce through the honey are more simple sugars. So during the fermentation process, it's going to ferment those sugars very cleanly. So this beer ends up, although it does have, again, a nice sweet complexion to it because of the subdued bitterness from the hops. We don't hop it too much, we keep it pretty light. It actually finishes more dry than our other beers. So there is less residual sugar remaining at the end of fermentation because of the honey addition that we use. It's the same yeast as our 1919, it's our Ardennes yeast. So same yeast is used in our 1919, our Golden Ale, and our Belgian IPA. But it also just shows how, depending on what else you bring to the table, the beers can be so drastically different from each other. So this beer, although it has the honey flavor and aroma, there isn't a lot of residual sugar, and it's not actually sweet, but there is that sweet perception. Anyways, let's get to drinking it. Similar to the summer lager, it is very clear, nice golden color, a little bit more of a golden complexion to it compared to the summer lager, but again, a nice pillowy white head on top. This one you get the Belgian characteristic from the yeast. There is some honey floral. It does actually smell like a bouquet of flowers. But then there is still that grain component to it as well. So this beer has a little bit more substance to it than the summer lager, but it's not going to be as creamy and pillowy and have as robust a mouthfeel as the Hefeweizen. It's kind of in the middle of the two of them. Again, that Belgian characteristic, that Ardennes yeast is contributing, again, a little bit of a clove flavor, but the real difference with this one is also that we use Strisselspalt as the hops. That's a hop that originated in France, and it's used in more delicate bouquet style beers. So that comes through as well, and it is, although it's hard to pick up on, it is really what defines how this beer tastes. So our fourth and final beer of the virtual tasting is our Monarchy English Brown Ale. This is the type of beer that you will experience if you are doing a pub crawl in Northern England. England has some very stereotypical components, like things that make beer specifically English. One of them is the yeast that is used there, and so in each of the 4 beers that we've had today, they've all used actually different yeasts. We had our lager yeast in our summer lager, we have a traditional Bavarian yeast that is used in our wheat beer, and then our Belgian Ardennes yeast in the Golden Ale. This is actually what is called a London ale yeast. So again, it's an ale yeast, it's gonna rip through fermentation really quickly, but leave behind a lot of substance, a lot of meat still on the bones for this kind of beer. So it's gonna have a lot more body. And so we decided to also lean into the English characteristic by using East Kent Goldings hops. Those hops have a very earthy tone to it, and that really goes well with the brown ale that we've created here. So typically with the majority of our beers, our base malt, our malt that is going to be used to provide the majority of the sugars that we're going to use for fermentation, we use a Pilsner malt. But with this one, being an English style beer, we've imported grains from England and are using Maris Otter, which is a pale malt. We also have some chocolate malt and some caramel malt in there. It sounds like we're creating an ice cream sundae, but really those malts are just really defining how dark the beer is going to be. The chocolate malt tastes a lot closer to a coffee bean than chewing on a chocolate bar. And same thing with the caramel. It all is about how they are malted. Caramel malts, they're going to be steeping the grains a lot more. And with the Maillard reactions breaking down those carbons, we're almost caramelizing the sugars inside of that grain, which is why it has that name, caramel malt. So the grains themselves are going to contribute all of the color to the beer. So this beer is nice and dark. When you get it in a thin glass where you can see through it, it has almost a ruby red brown complexion to it. In a thicker glass, the light can't pass through, and so it just has a nice dark brown character. The beer itself has the earthy complexion from the hops, the East Kent Goldings, as I mentioned, and I think it's just time to try it. Let's go. So compared to the other beers that had bright white heads, this one is going to have more of a tan colored head on it. So as you can see, this glass is allowing the light to pass through. So it's still a nice clear beer, and it does have a wonderful brown complexion to it. On the nose, there's a nuttiness. I get toffee. There is that earthy component coming from the East Kent Goldings hops that we used. And again, I've been able to experience beers in England, and I feel like this is a great representation of what you'll experience getting a cask ale, a brown ale in Northern England. So this beer is one of the sweeter beers that we have. The residual sugars left in it are a little bit higher than the other ones, but then that East Kent Goldings really rounds it out, having that earthy component to it. It's nutty, it's sweet, kind of like a dark fruit sweetness, and again, I get toffee, I get toast. This is a very traditional example of a brown ale. They don't have a very dramatic citrusy hop characteristic to it. It's more about the grains and the water and everything shining through. Thank you very much for joining us on the virtual tasting. We really appreciate your support by buying the beers and following the link to join us for the tasting. Hope you had fun. If you ever want to know anything more about what's going on with us at Little Brown Jug, you can follow us on our social media or head to our website, littlebrownjug.ca, where you can sign up for our newsletter and stay up to date on all things Little Brown Jug. Or come down to the brewery. I'm here on the patio. You can come. Our tasting room is open again, so come sample all the beers that we offer here. It's at 336 William in the Exchange District in Winnipeg. See you soon.
It's been a while, but we are back. Back to good times. Together again.